The Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF.
For Real Agriculture, I'm Kelvin Hepner at Manitoba Crop Diagnostic School, and we are joined for this episode of the Pulse School by Dennis Lange, who is the provincial pulse and soybean specialist with Manitoba Agriculture. Dennis, talking about fungicide decisions in peas, specifically around mycosphaerella blight. Take us through the decision process of whether or not this plot behind us needs a fungicide application.
Oh, thank you. What we typically look at when we're looking at mycosphaerella blight in peas is we want to first be able to identify what disease we do have present. So when you're looking at mycosphaerella blight, you want to look down into the lower canopy around that early flowering time period. But what we're looking for is small purple freckles. Okay, that's making sure that we have that disease actually present. There are diseases such as bacterial blight that sometimes can be mistaken for it. But the main difference between the two is mycosphaerella blight typically is something, number one, we have a fungicide option to spray for. But when you look at the lesion itself on the leaf, it's more of a purple freckle. And that purple freckle, when it expands and grows larger, it can actually cover the entire leaf. Whereas with a bacterial blight, usually that is brought on by a weather event in the last couple of weeks, usually in the mid to upper canopy, where mycosphaerella is more in the lower canopy. And the difference there is that lesion typically would have a yellow ring around it, and usually is bordered by the veins of the leaf. So that's one distinguishing factor. But once you've kind of gone in and checked your field, one of the things you need to kind of look at is you need to look at, what are the risk factors? Some of the risk factors that we look at is, do we have a dense crop canopy? So, for example, in the stand that we see behind us here, we have a very dense canopy. So that's definitely something that could favor mycosphaerella blight. Other thing we look at is like leaf wetness and dew, and what the humidity is like in the mornings. And in this case, we've had a lot of heavy dews the last few mornings. We've had some fog, so a very wet canopy down below. So again, another factor that favors that disease development. The 5-day forecast, well, this year we can pretty much say rain, just because we've been getting rain almost every day in different areas. So that also increases your score. Finally, you need to look at symptoms on the plant. So if there's no visible symptoms, then chances are you might want to hold off on your spraying a bit. But in this particular plot that we're seeing here, we're seeing about 20% infection in the lower canopy. So when you do that total score, you come up with about a score of 80. And what that tells me is that anything over 65 is good for spraying. And if you're at 80, that means maybe you should have been in there scouting a little bit earlier. But when you're at that score right now, that means that you're going in with your fungicide application, in the next day or so. Then what you're doing is you're waiting that 9 to 10 days, depending on weather conditions, and then reevaluating if you need to do that second spray. This year, based on the weather conditions that we're seeing, more than likely we're going to see growers spraying twice this year. And what's also really important when you're looking at spraying twice is you're looking at rotating some of the fungicide groups. So rather than just using group 11, which they have found some resistance in other areas, you need to look at using different groups. Some products have three-way groups that you can use on your crop, and then that way when you're coming back a second time, you have different ways of controlling that disease in crops, so not to build up any resistance moving forward. So it's just something I encourage growers to do on a year like this with lots of moisture. Decision is probably pretty obvious, but on years where it's drier, like in past years, sometimes what you can do is maybe delay that first application. Every crop will get mycosphaerella blight at some point, but the later it sets in, the less it affects the crop yield. So if you can delay that first application because conditions aren't suited, because it's been too dry or maybe no lesions present, then you might be able to get away with that single application rather than going twice.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for your time again today, Dennis.
Thank you, Kelvin.